today. Brian's not only a knowledgeable birder, but also a wonderful photographer. Gene and I had taken some of his courses at McGee Marsh, and I think even in Florida we ran into him. So it's a pleasure to have him with us. And after he's done, we'll do some questions, and then we'll have a short membership meeting. But this time, I'm going to introduce Larry. He's our program director, and he'll introduce Brian.
Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Tonight we're going to join Brian for an exploration into the magnificent behavior of shorebirds. From migration to the breeding grounds and beyond, Brian will share his passion for shorebird behavior through his award-winning photography and personal experiences on the breeding grounds of the high Arctic. Be forewarned, you may never look at a wintering shorebird on a beach or a mudflat the same way again. Brian began his journey with birds by enrolling in an ornithology class at Hockton College in 1993. For years he largely ignored shorebirds. That changed when he experienced them on the breeding grounds in Alaska for the first time. Brian has since returned to Alaska year after year, always in pursuit of new and exciting shorebird images. Brian is co-owner and photo tour leader at Saberwing Nature Tours. His award-winning photography has been displayed at the National Center for Nature Photography, and his work has been internationally published in books and magazines, including Birders World, Bird Watching, and Birds in Bloom. Brian Zwiebel.
Thank you, Larry. Much appreciated. Again, Larry mentioned I'm from Saberwing Nature Tours. I absolutely just love being out in new places, photographing the birds. Larry's going to get the lights for us. But also to share those experiences with the folks that I travel with. Shorebirds have become a real passion for me. Early on in my birding career, I ignored them because I couldn't identify them. But once you're laying in the mudflat with them and get close-up views, you can really identify them by just getting those close views versus the scope through their heat shimmer from 100 yards away. Just the opening slide here is an American avocet. We've got a Baird's sandpiper here, and just check the focus. That's a little better. The Baird's sandpiper was one of those species, like I'd never encountered a Baird's sandpiper, mainly because I didn't know how to identify it. But once I started to recognize the shape, the long wings, the color, I started seeing them a lot more regularly, and I've since photographed them in a number of different situations. They're called a grass piper. They like more shallow areas, a little bit higher and drier most of the time. Photographed them bathing and preening, ruffling their feathers in Lake Superior. I was actually in Lake Superior, no waders, super cold. Anything for the shot. They're very friendly on the breeding grounds. They'll wave at you if you hang out with them. This is part of their courtship display. I'm not sure what he's doing, but it looks like he's having a good time at Maumee Bay State Park. Now, these are all Baird's sandpipers. They like to speed skate. Most people don't know that. But sandpipers are wildly adaptive in how they forage, in migration, etc. So we're going to explore a lot of those things, including some breeding behavior. This is a long-billed dowitcher, super long bill. They can get to things under the water and in the mud that the short-billed birds can't reach. Here's a short-billed doing their sewing machine motion of foraging. And the bill tip is actually flexible down at the tip, so it's closed, but when it senses something, there's all kinds of nerve endings in the tip of the bill. When it senses prey, it can actually flex that open in order to capture it. American woodcock is a very unusual shorebird, not found where most other shorebirds are, in the forest, super well camouflaged. We've got a long-billed curlew, super, again, long-billed, prying into the mud for crabs and such. Some shorebirds are going after things with shells and crushing them up in their gizzard. This is a red knot feeding on zebra mussels. Willet will also crush these different kinds of clams and things in their bill, and so they actually have to regurgitate a pellet, much like an owl would, to get rid of some of those things that they can't digest. Ruddy turnstone's another one that will go after things that have a hard shell on them. Some sandpipers arrive on their breeding ground before season has started. So there's still snow and ice around. They have to have some fat reserves, not only for migration, but once they arrive, if there's a cold snap, they need to be able to survive until the insects start coming out. So they show up in good shape on the breeding grounds. It's a semi-palmated sandpiper. Semi-palmated is referring to the, where's the little, there we go. Little partially webbed foot is what semi-palmated is referring to in that sandpiper and plover. American avocets will forage in groups, much like cormorants and pelicans will, in order to basically herd the prey. And what I observed with this group is the leading bunch would just run and not feed, and the ones behind would get the bill down and skim back and forth through the water. And then they would kind of rotate out, much like birds do in migration. So the lead birds are doing more work, not getting the reward, but they get to circle back to the back and then get that reward. Yellowlegs sometimes will be very active feeders, actually chasing and pursuing minnows through the water at a high rate of speed. Pretty cool to see. And the plovers with their short bills, they're more adept at plucking things off the surface. So a marine worm that is just above the surface, it's going to grab on it, pull, and try to pull it out of its little burrow. There's a Wilson's plover with a tiny little crab. And this bird just very adeptly clipped off every single one of the legs before swallowing the abdomen whole. I don't think it even dropped it. It would snip them and just kept flipping it around. So buff-breast's a sandpiper, an oldie for sure, but they're another one of the grass pipers, and they forage. They eat a lot of moths, actually. Pluck them out of the grass. This is at Maumee Bay State Park. There's a group of 5 of them, I believe, that would forage up and down, mostly in the grass. Occasionally they'd go to the water's edge and bathe and such. Some birds are fairly active feeders. Everybody's seen sanderlings at the beach, right, chasing the waves. And then they go and capture something. And they pull it up. This one right here in the middle's got a little bug, and we're going to get a closer up shot of what that looks like. And you actually see this is a beach hopper. So you've been to the beach and the waves go back and you see all the little holes and the bubbles coming up. That's these beach hoppers digging down into the sand. The sanderlings are foraging on them. That's why they behave the way they do with the wave chasing. And a super close up. So the phalaropes, interesting group of birds. They do some spin feeding, kind of like a top. Got to use a really, really fast shutter speed to freeze that action. For the photographers, roughly 1/2000th of a second or faster to freeze the spinning. This one's actually tipping like a duck a little bit. And this red-necked phalarope, you can see the spin feeding going on, spinning like a top, pulling up the invertebrates off the bottom of the shallow tundra ponds, and then just stabbing at the water like little maniacs. This is a piping plover, and clearly it's ready for migration. It's kind of round like a softball, no neck, tiny little head. Does anybody know what species this is? We don't see them looking like this around here very much. This is actually a sanderling in full breeding plumage. And again, they're not normally that plump, but this one was certainly, this was taken at Whitefish Point in Lake Superior. So this bird's next stop would probably be at its breeding grounds up on the high tundra in the Arctic. Super ready for migration. You see all the fat reserves this bird has. So foraging and feeding is really important to these birds, and they will defend feeding territories as well as breeding territories. So this sanderling is squaring off with another of its kind, angling its back, spreading its wings a little bit to make itself look bigger. That's also, it can defend that food source and succeed at migration. Here's a couple of semi-palmated plovers squabbling over basically overfeeding rights. So interestingly, this is a Whimbrel, and this is not my photograph, unfortunately. This belongs to Jamie Cunningham, who's one of our guides. But what is this Whimbrel doing? He's got his wings outstretched. Looks like maybe he's trying to claim a feeding territory or something. Well, this little piping plover over here, 1/7 its size, is fighting with this bird because it's got a nest in the area. So the piping plover is going to stand up to this great big Whimbrel. And the Whimbrel is like, I'm going to eat here. And the piping plover says, no, you're not. And eventually, the piping plover drove the Whimbrel off, which is really, really impressive. That's a bad little bird right there. But for me, there's really nothing more special than the beautiful light of the midnight sun in the high Arctic. This is the American golden plover, taken at probably about 1 o'clock in the morning at Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This bird's singing to attract a mate. And they just exhibit all kinds of crazy breeding behaviors. The golden plovers will do parallel flights at an adjoining territory with another male. This was wildly, just pure luck to capture this. Dane, I know, can tell you that this would be a really tough shot to get a plover flying right at you. In the snow, low light, the autofocus doesn't work well. I couldn't believe it was actually sharp, but this bird was actually displaying against another adjacent male on the tundra, trying to define the territory boundary. A lot of birds will do aerial displays. This is a black-necked stilt. Black-necked stilts and American avocets especially will actually attack humans that are coming too close to where they may be nesting. I've actually had an avocet dive bombing me while I was walking down the road just because it was nesting down in the marsh somewhere. Marbled Godwits too, really crazy about attacking people. Anybody just hear the great horned owl? Yeah. Cool. Nice effect. Most of the time we think of shorebirds being on the ground. Snipe will occasionally tee up on a post to display and sing. This is in the prairie pothole region. But Hudsonian Godwits will tee up on stunted black spruce in Canada. This is from Churchill. But one of the great joys is experiencing things that I've never read about before. In this case, this group of long-billed dowitchers at Barrow, we hadn't seen any long-billed dowitchers the previous couple of days. And then we noticed a flock of them, so we decided to kind of watch and see what was going on. And what was happening is one bird would pick up a tiny little willow twig and kind of hold it for a minute and drop it. And he'd wander off and another bird would try to go get that twig. The first bird would come back and you'd have a big fight over this little twig, like for no reason, right? And they would fight, wing beat each other, claw at each other, chase each other off. Do you know another bird would come pick up that stupid stick? And this was continuing on and on. So we'd have these battles of the long-billed dowitchers pulling feathers even off the other's belly and chasing each other off. Well, the next day we came back to the area, no flock, but there were pairs of the long-billed dowitchers all over the tundra. It was certainly part of the mate selection process. They showed up as a flock, and then the pair bonding didn't happen until they arrived on the tundra, as best we could tell. Couldn't wait to get home and read about it. There's absolutely nothing in the literature about it. So it was pretty cool. The phalaropes, we talked about the phalaropes earlier and the spin feeding, etc. They have actually a kind of a reverse sexual role in breeding. The male is much more, I guess, let's say the female's more saturated, more contrast, more color. The male's more subdued. This is the male copulating with the female. And you can see the same with the red phalarope. The male is just not nearly as contrasty. The color's not as vivid. The face with that black marking versus the white eye patch, just not nearly as bold as the female. And so why is that? It's because the male actually tends to the nest. The female is going to lay the eggs, and the male's going to tend to the nest. She may go find another male and lay another clutch of 4 eggs with yet another male. Laying eggs equivalent to more than half of her body weight over the course of just a couple of weeks, pretty insane. So she heads south. A lot of these early migrant shorebirds that we're seeing in late June and July, a lot of them are females who have nested successfully, but the males are staying with the young. Or they're males and females of a nest that was not successful. Sorry, blacked out there. Some of the other shorebird behaviors that I've seen, the Dunlin, beautiful bird, fantastic. We think about some of the behaviors that are familiar to us. A buff-breasted sandpiper is known for the lecking and the wing displays, etc. Most people don't know that Dunlins also do a wing display on the tundra. This guy had his wing up and he was calling, and he marched downhill and actually copulated with a female that was kind of hunkered down in a low spot. There's the march. I'm not sure if the wing's clipping off the top. Dane will be happy to know that the wingtip is in place on my view. So calling, just attracting a mate, right? Raising the wing, calling, flashing towards a female. This is a white-rumped sandpiper, a great bird no matter where you encounter it. It's never common or numerous anywhere in the States. Happy to get the portrait shot. There's the white rump for you. But I came across this bird and it was doing all this weird wing waving thing, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. What had happened is the group had gotten between this male and the female that he was courting. Didn't even know the female was there. They tend to hunker down and stay out of sight. So I believe this wing up display is more just of a contact, staying in contact with the mate. We kind of got in front of them, between them in the line of sight and everything. It was just like, hey, I'm still here, baby. Don't leave me. We talked about earlier on, Larry talked about not looking at shorebirds the same way again. So you're kind of starting to see where that's coming from, right? Semi-palmated sandpipers on a mudflat, they're quiet, they're feeding, they're non-obtrusive. On the breeding grounds, they are off the hook. Calling, wing up displays, like running around, chasing the females. But they also do this really cool hover flight. And they'll hover in place for 45 seconds or more, and they'll actually drift backwards. If the wind is strong enough, they'll pull up and hover, and they'll start drifting backwards with the wind. But when they do fly up, they kind of repeat this process over and over. It gives me a chance to get in place to get a unique shot. So I did some shots with the fast shutter speed where the wings are frozen and everything. I thought this bird is completely stationary. I can really slow the shutter, still get a sharp shot of the bird, but blur the wings out. Really holding himself in place there. Buff-breasted sandpiper is one of the reasons I went to the high tundra in the first place, to try to photograph them, and I was fortunate to do so at Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And it was that behavior I was interested in, right? The wings up, the lecking process. This is certainly well past midnight on the tundra. And as I'm taking this picture, I'm thinking, man, this bird just is coming closer and closer to me. It's unbelievable. And I remembered a communication I'd had with Kevin Carlson pre-trip, and he said, the males will actually display to people. And I'm sure that's what was going on. I was near the lek, and he was just coming closer and closer to me. I'm literally backing up to keep the bird in the frame. Nice problem to have. Here's a back view of the display. And here's a very disinterested female. she don't care. But certainly one of the more enjoyable experiences I've ever had is spending a few hours on the tundra with some lekking buff-breasted sandpipers. This is an embrace display, and what's happening here is the females are inspecting the underwing lining of the male. And this is actually, photo belongs to Tyler Ficker, one of our other guides. And I don't know what I was doing. I was there. I didn't take the shot. I think I was just watching the behavior and forgot to take pictures. Pretty cool. Sometimes a male will act like a female and come in close like that as if it's inspecting the displaying male's underwing lining just to get in position to chase him off. So this is a ruff, and it is not a very common breeder in the U.S. Very, very limited. More of a Northern Europe and Russia breeding bird. But they really they will also lek. There's not enough of them breeding in the U.S. where I don't think anybody's ever seen them lekking in the States. But they will also lek. The males are going to fluff up that ruff, chase the females around. This bird, there was no female, so he was displaying to anybody that would pay any attention. So he was displaying to what I presume was a female pectoral sandpiper. And the male didn't like that very much. So you got this little pectoral sandpiper trying to stand up to this guy. And with the long legs, they could just run across the tundra. It's super, super fast. But really a quite gorgeous bird. Speaking of the pectoral sandpipers, they get their name for the kind of the bib, the pectoral line that cuts across the chest. And in a migration, we see that and use it for identification, but it becomes more pronounced on the breeding grounds. Here you can see it's puffed up a little bit. The bird's on its tiptoes, surveying his terrain. There you can see the chest sticking out a little bit more. There's actually air pockets in there that they can inflate. I want to share with you real quickly my first time to Barrow. I thought I'd done my research, knew the bird songs, knew how to identify them, and on the first night on the tundra, I hear this. Oops. Oh, wait, hang on. Let's try that again. Lapland longspur in the background. So the first time I heard this, I'm like, what in the world is going on? No idea what it was. But after watching and observing, started to see the pectoral sandpipers were actually doing a flight display. They would stand on their little mound and then they would fly and extend their chest and do the call as they flew over top the female. And they would circle back around to their original mound, so I realized I could get in position to try to capture that display flight. They do all kinds of crazy stuff. So wings up, calling, chest out, flight displays. Here the chest is really out. He looks like he's about 9 months pregnant. If you look closely, anybody spot her? And I mentioned the golden plovers doing a parallel territory kind of display flight. The golden plovers and the pectorals do the same thing with defining the territory boundaries, but they also do it as a march. kind of a parallel marching down that boundary line. Kind of picturing two soldiers, one from maybe North Korea and South Korea or something, walking down the border line. And there's the marching. So the display flight then, they puff up that chest, and here it doesn't look super, it looks more like a keel than super puffed up. But they really, really will puff that thing up, do their calling, fly over the female, and towards the end of the flight, things really start to hang out and actually bob up and down is where that vocalization is coming from that I played. That sound is in rhythm with that chest bouncing up and down. But sadly, towards the very end, it kind of starts to look like the Dunlap spare tire. Most of our shorebirds lay 4 eggs, very well camouflaged. Black-bellied plover eggs, if I remember correctly. Yeah, black-bellied plover. So we're familiar with killdeer. They'll do a broken wing display. These birds, when they're on a nest and laying flat, are totally camouflaged. You can't even tell they're there. And then they get up and kind of do this broken wing and try to distract the predator, that's me, from their nesting territory. All this breeding behavior is to get to this point where we're going to lay eggs and raise young. This is an avocet's actually turning the eggs in the nest. And these are some fairly recently hatched American avocet chicks. Still see the egg tooth right there on the tip of the bill. That little hardened part of the bill that helps them break out of the egg. Can't have enough American avocet chicks. How many legs do you see in there? There's at least 2 already underneath the adult, with one more trying to find space. Why in the world do I have a lemming on in a shorebird display, shorebird program? So this is a collared lemming from the tundra at Barrow. And they're the base of the food chain up there for all the predators. And you've got parasitic Jaegers, you got Pomeranian Jaegers, long-tailed Jaegers, Arctic fox, you name it. All these predators, snowy owls and gulls. When the prey base is good, it's good for all of those predators, right? It's also good for the shorebirds. Because they're the secondary piece of the prey base for those top predators. So when there's lots of lemmings around, the shorebirds have a very good nesting success for the most part. There's definitely a big correlation between the lemming population and the success of the nesting shorebirds. I've seen Pomeranian Jaegers tearing apart red-necked phalaropes, adult red-necked phalaropes. I've seen them consuming eggs and chicks. I've been fortunate enough, this is a western sandpiper chick. Fortunate enough to see a western sandpiper chick still in the bottom cup of the egg, just breaking out of it. Pretty special stuff. But to avoid these predators, we have a lot of adaptation to camouflage. This is a surf bird, and when I photographed it from the back of the boat and looked down to check my exposure on the camera, I looked back up, I thought the bird had flown off. I could not reacquire it without the magnification of my binoculars or my lens. American woodcock, super well camouflaged. Look at the adaptation of the high-set eyes. That's so when it's foraging into the forest floor, the eyes are really still pointed up and can see basically 360 degrees around while its face is down, searching for food. Great adaptation, looking for danger. This is a red knot on the nest, and actually one of my participants at Nome nearly stepped on it. We were looking for red knots specifically, and we were just wandering back towards the vehicle. Actually, we hadn't seen any, and he stopped about 1.5 steps from it when he first. And the bird hadn't moved. The bird never moved. He backed up, called everybody over, and we were able to image it without ever disturbing it from the nest. So you're going to see a theme of the back pattern and how it really blends into its environment. The buff-breasted sandpiper is very golden tone overall. The grasses don't green up on the tundra until later in the season, at which point they've mostly completed their nesting process. You can see a little bit of the green shoots starting to come up, but it's still mostly, the previous year's dried grasses. The back pattern on a Dunlin, that orange and black, really matches the leftover autumn leaves from the willow scrub. You can see that coloration in the background. And if they see a predator, they're going to hunker down, lay flat, hide that white part of their belly, and they will lay there motionless while the predator flies by. Ruddy turnstones are in places where the tundra's actually been turned up by frost heaval and stuff, so you get a lot of this black soil and some of the lichens and stuff. So the turnstone is, really got a lot of dark in the plumage. And that's where you'll find them. It seems very random when you're out driving the tundra, but when you see one of these spots where there's the polygon tundra has some upheaval and some darkness to it, that's where you're going to find this species. Even though it's not abundant up there, you can find it by picking out those areas. They're just a little different than everything else. This red knot with his orange breast, look at the lichens on the rocks around it. The whole hillside is covered with these orange lichen-covered rocks. The snowy plover on a white sand beach virtually disappears. I'm going to tell a story about a pectoral sandpiper. We'll get into the purple sandpiper here in a quick second. But I was photographing a pectoral sandpiper on the tundra, and she laid down flat, just pressed herself right to the ground and turned her head like this and laid there motionless. I had 10x binoculars, and I was laying down with her. So I rolled over on my side, and I start scanning the horizon. It took several minutes with 10x binoculars before I could find the speck of a peregrine falcon that was actually coming closer to us at that point. She spotted that thing naked eye. The bird was probably twice as far away as what I could see it with 10x binoculars. Their adaptations, we might be smart, but we are not built for survival like that. Just amazing stuff. Anyway, this purple sandpiper, hadn't seen any purple sandpipers at Whitefish Point. This was actually a very early record in the season for it. And a bird flew by and landed in a shallow spot and just disappeared, laid itself flat. And I'm like, there's a predator around. This bird is hiding from something. And a few seconds later, a merlin went blasting down the beach. And the bird stayed there motionless for several minutes. And it got up and started foraging around. And all of a sudden, it jumped, flew a short distance, landed in my shadow, and flattened itself. Now, closer than my laptop to me, flew and landed in my shadow. That merlin had circled and come back, and I think he knew in the shadow and close to me that the merlin probably wasn't going to come after it. I couldn't get rid of this bird the rest of the day. It was literally every time I'm trying to photograph it, I have to get up and move further away and lay back down again. A pretty cool experience. The same thing happened with a Townsend solitaire at Holden Arboretum. There was a Townsend solitaire forever ago, and that bird would come and perch next to people to keep the mockingbirds from harassing it. Pretty cool. So these birds spend a ton of time preening, especially during the migration season. Up to 5-10% of the day is spent preening the feathers, keeping them in top condition. This is a solitary sandpiper, and its bathing process was so rapid I couldn't even really see what was happening. I cranked up the shutter speed and just tried to capture something of it. Was able to capture this, but he would smash into the water, jump up, fly 8 to 10 feet, smash into the water again. And it was just to soak its feathers for the bathing and preening process. It's a short-billed dowitcher doing some dipping and throwing water around on itself. And typically through the process, it's going to shake off some of the excess water. Sometimes when they're shaken, they get into the air and drop back down to the earth, but they're going to spend a lot of time picking through, like literally every feather. If they can't reach it with their bill tip, they'll rub the back of their head on their back or on their wing, scratch with their feet, just really trying to keep everything in good shape. There's the chin scratch. So why is it so important for these birds to keep their feathers in top condition? Actually, this bird's actually getting oil off its oil gland for waterproofing. You can see this long-billed dowitcher actually squeezing the oil gland to get some oil, keep everything in top shape. There's that solitary, pulling every feather between its bill. This is a stilt sandpiper, and just a little piece on identification. So these feathers that are all scalloped, that makes this a juvenile bird. So this is a first fall migration. That scalloped look is pretty common in many of the young shorebirds as they're first heading south. These other feathers are new feathers that are coming in to replace that juvenile plumage. You'll see the feather edging is gone. This is going to be their first winter plumage, where they're much more gray. Anyway, that's a very irritating, and molt is a very irritating thing, so they spend a lot of time preening during the molt as well. After they get done preening, a lot of times they're going to ruffle out those feathers, try to get them to lay back where they're supposed to. And sometimes you'll see a wing stretch. If you see one wing stretch, I always anticipate that it's probably going to stretch the other one. And if you see both wing stretches, then sometimes they tip forward and throw their wings up in the air. A lot of anticipation in the photography, kind of knowing what they're going to do based on experience. This is the lesser yellow legs. Did one stretch, two stretch, and then the double stretch. So these birds migrate huge distances, and that's the need for having their feathers in top condition at all times. Big group of shorebirds here. There's some places around the U.S. and Canada where just huge numbers of shorebirds congregate in migration. This is Point Reyes, California. These are surely almost all western sandpipers. Just massive numbers of the birds. A group of Dunlin on the east coast, resting during migration. Got a phalarope. Some of the phalaropes stage in huge numbers at Great Salt Lake. Both red-necked and Wilson's phalaropes, to the point where clouds of birds will come up off of the lake. Some other tells on migration, the bared sandpipers, right? They're longer than the semi-palmated sandpipers. They migrate further. Longer winged shorebirds of a similar size typically are going to migrate further. Just look got this stretched out appearance. Those long wings help take them all the way to Argentina. This bird, amazingly enough, showed up during Biggest Week festival a couple of years ago. It's a curlew sandpiper. In North America, it's almost always seen in winter plumage. This bird ended up in a farm field out west of Toledo, which it probably would have, what are the odds of it being found, right? Unless there's a ton of birders in the area. It hung around for a couple of days and posed for many pictures. So pectoral sandpipers have one of the longest migrations of any. They breed clear over in Siberia, and they'll come across to Alaska and northern Canada before heading south, and they end up at the very tip of South America in winter. And I've actually, for some reason, the projector's cropping in right now, so I'm just going to read this. Pectoral sandpipers have the longest migration route. They travel from the breeding grounds as far north as northern Siberia to Argentina at the southern tip of South America. Whimbrel, has anybody heard about the Whimbrel migrations in the Atlantic? So really cool. These birds will fly from pretty far west in Canada and Alaska, and migrate all the way to New Brunswick and Maine and some of the maritime provinces of Canada. And they wait for the correct winds, and then they launch out over the North Atlantic. Occasionally they run into a hurricane, and they've been known to fly through hurricanes. And Whimbrels have been known to fly through hurricanes during fall migration. One bird fitted with a tracking device flew into Hurricane Irene in 2011, and she spent 27 hours flying into strong headwinds over the Atlantic, no place to land, gaining 9 miles per hour average speed. Once she went through the eye and came out the backside of the hurricane, her speed increased to almost 100 miles per hour, and actually made it to land in the Bahamas. Tough birds. And there's kind of the circle route of the Whimbrel, northbound through the plains to Canada and Alaska, and east, then southbound across the Atlantic Ocean, sometimes passing closer to Africa than the Americas as it's moving southbound, just to take advantage of winds. But the real champion is the bar-tailed Godwit. Anybody hear about the bar-tailed Godwit migration? Even crazier than the Whimbrel. So they breed in northern Alaska, and they come down to the Alaskan Peninsula, just where the Aleutian Islands begin, but on the mainland, on the peninsula there. And they forage and stage and build up fat reserves there. And then the birds launch out over the Pacific Ocean towards Hawaii. They don't stop at Hawaii. They just use that as a kind of a guide point, I guess. They kind of turn towards New Zealand and Australia when they get closer to Hawaii. So these birds do a nonstop flight. The longest one recorded, 7,500 miles in 11 days nonstop. So how in the world do these birds do this? And this is old information. The updated information, I think, is the bird from this year. It took 11 days. It took so much longer because there were strong east winds, and it got pushed further northeast. It had to kind of adjust its route and get back to New Zealand the long way, as if that wasn't long enough, right? But the way they do this is they actually start to absorb and shrink some of their internal organs to create more space for fat reserves. So 11 days, nonstop flight, no sleep, no food, no water. The water that they're getting, obviously they need some, is the byproduct of burning the fat. And I get winded just going up a flight of stairs. So, and here's the route from the Alaskan Peninsula all the way down to New Zealand. The northbound route, a little easier. They make a couple more stops and go through China, where there's some serious issues with habitat availability and things like that. I'm leaving you with a very beautiful Baird sandpiper. I can't get enough of them. I have probably 1,000 pictures of Baird sandpipers, but what kind of questions do we have about shorebirds?
When they get where they're going, how long do they stay?
Really variable. That's a pretty broad question, but these birds, when they go down, we think of them as our birds, right? They spend more time somewhere else than they do in North America. Spend a lot more time migrating, overwintering, and migrating back. The breeding season is pretty short for these birds that are way up north.
When you're in the far reaches of the north there, and it's sunny so late at night, do you get any sleep?
So funny thing, literally every new group up there, it's probably their first time seeing a lot of these birds, right? So they want to go out, they want to see them all, and even if the weather's garbage, it's really hard to get them to want to quit. But as the leader, I have to kind of control that. I'll take you out, we'll go see some birds, but we're going to get some rest when it's rainy or real foggy or whatever. Because there have been times where we've gone out after dinner, 6 p.m., and photographed till 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10 o'clock the next morning because the light is spectacular all night long. So we sleep when we're tired and when the weather's bad. Otherwise, we're out there. And Pro tip, the fog rolled in one night about 12:30. And when it does, it's usually foggy till 9, 10 o'clock the next morning. So I had a prescription for Ambien, mainly for the flight back. I had direct flight from Anchorage to Detroit, knocked myself out for the 8-hour flight and I'm good to go. And we had been pushing really, really hard. I'm like, thank God, ice fog. We're done till like 9 o'clock. I took an Ambien to knock myself out. Like 10 minutes later, one of the participants calls. He says, hey, it just got beautiful out. I'm like, no way, no, it didn't. Drank 2 Red Bulls on top of the Ambien, went out and photographed all night long. I have no memory of that night. Yeah.
You've been going to Alaska for a number of years?
Yes. My first trip there was in 2007. And after, let me rephrase that. My first trip to Alaska, that was my first trip to Barrow. My first trip to Alaska, I was still shooting film. It was probably about 2004. Went up to, that was Nome, and I've been up to Barrow, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Pribilof Islands, Dutch Harbor, out in the Aleutians, down to Homer. Did a big circle route through the interior up to Fairbanks and across the Denali Highway. There's still 100 places to see, though.
Have you noticed any changes from warming?
Interesting, and it's not what you might think. So the last few times up there, and I've been going to Barrow roughly the same dates, so arriving June 7th, 8th, and staying roughly a week. But the last few years, there's been a lot more snow on the ground. And the thaw has actually seemed to come much later because of all that snow that needs to melt off. And what's happening is, in my opinion, you guys know what lake effect snow is. I think the ocean is staying open later into the winter, and therefore there's more moisture exposed and more snow falling earlier in the season before the ocean freezes over completely. Then there's just a lot more to melt off come spring. But yeah, I think that's what's going on there. It seems like, wow, it's a late thaw, but I think there's just so much more to melt than there has been previously. It's because it's an Arctic desert. Previously the precipitation's been low enough that it qualifies as a desert type conditions. But everything's soaking wet because of the tundra frost or the permafrost. There's no place for it to go, so it just sits there. Yeah.
Do you have to be careful about walking on the ancient lichens and beautiful mosses and whatever? Are there specific areas where you walk, or can you go anywhere?
You can go anywhere, and a lot of it's grassy. If you get around the polygons where things are heaved up a little bit, there it's dry enough that you get the reindeer moss. It's kind of a white moss. It looks like antlers. And then you do get some of the much smaller stuff. But it's such a vast place. There aren't really trails or anything like that. There are places where people drive snowmobiles across wet ground and really tear up, and the mud comes up, and you see four-wheel drive tracks. Vehicles are kept to the road for the most part. And there's a couple places where there's a short little boardwalk area at a research station.
It takes hundreds and hundreds of years for those lichens to grow.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about the oil gland in the birds?
So at the rump, just above the base of the tail, in waterfowl and in a lot of shorebirds, maybe most or even all shorebirds, I'm not sure, there's a gland there that secretes oil. And the birds use their bill and to get the oil onto the bill, and then they use that to cover the feathers to improve waterproofing. Yes?
How have the amount of population of the different species changed over this time since you've been going? Have you noticed it's stable or increased or decreased?
It has seemed pretty consistent for the most part. I do feel like maybe there's fewer eiders around. The first time I went up there there wasn't any photographers. There were birding tours like High Lonesome and some of the other really big bird tour companies were taking groups up there. There's an old picture of the old Arctic Inn at Barrow, and Ken Kaufman is a leader, and there's a dozen people lined up on a staircase that's on the outside of the building. The staircase isn't even there anymore, and the hotel's long been shuttered. But the first time I went up there, I couldn't find any information about photographing the area, just the birding information. But back to your point, there's a lot of people going up there now, smaller groups, individuals. I actually wrote a guide to birding and photography at Barrow, and I probably contributed to that to some degree.
Is that they're, like you were talking about birds that are attracted to, for the protection of humans at times, but would the increase in that kind of tourism, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it could be problematic. Anything that we do can cause problems for birds, whether that's having glass windows in our houses or driving down the highway and picking off a horned lark that flies up out of the ditch, or whatever. There's consequences for all of that, and certainly too many folks out there trying to pursue the birds and not necessarily the right way sometimes could cause issues, could cause them to go somewhere else. Anybody on this side? We're getting a lot of questions over here. Yes?
Have you been to Attu?
I have not. I would love to go, but I've not been further Aleutian chain than Dutch Harbor. And there's actually a flight now that you can go directly from Dutch Harbor to the Pribilofs. You'd have to go all the way back to Anchorage to fly back to the Pribilofs, and it's super cheap. It's like under $150 to fly from Dutch Harbor to St. George, and then it's another $25 to go to St. Paul from St. George. So big time saver there if you wanted to do multiple Bering Sea type locations. One day at 2. Gesundheit.
Is it closed now, or do they allow people on there?
From what I know, the people that are going on Attu now are living on a boat and taking Zodiacs to shore. I don't think there's any place that's open to stay on the island anymore.
What is that, Tim?
It's the furthest island out the Aleutian chain that's in the States. There's a couple more out there that are actually Russian.
So that's when you can sing Russia from Alaska.
Yeah, maybe. Question back?
Yeah, so when you do one of these trips to Alaska, what does that entail? I mean, like, is it a tent, are there varying lengths of the trips? Or is it always in a certain time of year when you see all this kind of stuff?
Yes, so for the shorebird behavior, June is the deal. I've been going to Barrow, like I said, that early June, 7 to 14, 15. I've gone to Nome after that, and that's where I'm seeing the actual chicks have been hatched already. You're further south; they're past that display point, but now they're raising young, feeding young. You get little chicks running on the tundra, which is pretty cool. You can do the Aleutians or the Pribs. You can do that later into the summer. The seabirds are there at the cliffs, and the main reason to go to Dutch Harbor is to go out on a boat to see the whiskered auklets. Adak's another place where you can get whiskered auklet on a fairly short boat ride. But I have been up in late September into early October, and up to Barrow. That's where you'll get big migrations of Ross's gulls. A spectacularly beautiful bird. And I was up there not this fall, the year before, in the hopes of seeing a Ross's gull. Well, the first day we saw one. The next day we saw 700. So it was a huge flight. But you can get ivory gulls. Species diversity is super low that time of year. Everything's mostly bugged out at that point. You'll still see some eiders flying around, but the shorebirds are mostly done at that point.
Have you
had an ivory?
I'm sorry?
Have you had an ivory gull?
I saw the ivory gull in Flint, Michigan, but I've not seen it. I've not seen it in Alaska. Strangely, it died after resting on the Flint River. Lead poisoning? Anyone? I think they determined it was actually West Nile on that bird. I could tell something wasn't right with it. Its eyes were a little squinted. Its face looked a little puffy. It did not look well, and it died a couple days later.
So a lot of the pictures you had of the displaying with the wing raised, it may have been a coincidence, but most of them look like right wing. So are they favoring one side, or is it just coincidence?
I never really thought about that. I'd have to go through and look at.
I'm just wondering if birds are right-handed or.
If they're not right-handed, they're wrong-handed, right? Yeah, I'd have to look through. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it. A lot of the phalaropes spin clockwise, but some do counterclockwise. On a maybe related note. Good question.
Right-footed.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Appreciate it.